Islam is a very green religion. There's so many beautiful ideas in Islam that ask us to steward the land.
This is Writer's Mosaic in Conversation. Dalia Al-Dujaili talks about her new book, Babylon Albion, a personal history of myth and migration.
So I'm a journalist. I'm an arts and culture journalist. I'm the online editor at the British Journal of Photography. I predominantly cover the Swana region, freelance writing.
Which is Southwest Asia, North Africa.
Exactly, yeah. It's a kind of decolonial term for the Middle East.
Or the Near East.
Or the Near East, exactly.
Or the Sykes-Picot area, the French and the British,
now
the Americans
now we're going way back.
divvied up.
And yeah, I'm the author of Babylon Albion, which is my debut non-fiction book. Babylon Albion is essentially part nature writing, part memoir, or nature memoir, if you will. And it essentially stemmed from my desire to explore what identity really means beyond the surface level. As someone who is a second-generation immigrant, who is the child of immigrant parents from Iraq, I grew up with the typical kind of identity crisis that a lot of us deal with growing up as children of immigrants. And I grew up in a semi-rural area. So
Surrey.
In Surrey, exactly.
Yes, the home counties.
Yeah, which was a really interesting place to grow up as a person of colour, first of all, and second of all, as a child of immigrants as well. It was not a place where diversity was common. So, yeah, I grew up with a lot of questions around my identity, and I think when I came to writing Babylon Albion, I was bringing along with me the works of brilliant thinkers, writers and practitioners that I had been speaking to over the course of my career. And I just became very, very inspired by other people's work, essentially, and I wanted to turn all of that into my own account of what it means to be Iraqi British.
Okay, well, you start the book with an absolutely beautiful prelude, and that prelude, like the Wordsworth one, is a sort of an account of becoming yourself. And within it you say that that you had never quite felt at home in your own body, as you later describe it as an Arab girl in Albion.
Yeah.
But with this book, somehow you had come to accept yourself, to become yourself. Could you describe that journey of becoming yourself with the writing of this book?
Yeah, I've been asked this a few times, about how the book allowed me to, I guess, reconcile those parts of myself that feel opposed to one another and at conflict with one another at times because of like socio-political or cultural, I guess, contexts or reasons. But essentially I found that I belonged both very much in my Iraqi culture and my Iraqi identity and very much in my British identity.
Simultaneously?
Yeah, I didn't feel...
Two people, one body.
Exactly. I never felt... I felt like it was external kind of factors or society that wanted me to fit into a box, and I never felt comfortable fitting into either. It's something that led me to creating my own magazine, which was The Road to Nowhere, and I specifically chose this word nowhere because I wanted to really embrace and reclaim ownership of this feeling of being nowhere, and by way of being nowhere, being everywhere at once. You are both things at once, and I think the places that I found that being reflected most was in nature, the way that nature is so dual, and the fact that rivers are so fluid, and the fact that they change course and no one questions that, and the fact that trees are constantly changing and moving and animals are migrating and no one questions that. But when people do the same, it's questioned, it's viewed with suspicion, and you're asked to fit into a certain box or category.
Okay, so you've got the notion that kind of nature, your own body, the world around you is in migratory movement. The forests, in fact, move over time, slowly, but they move.
They move.
We always used to say that, of course, the difference between us and the trees is that trees have got roots and we've got legs.
Yeah.
But that seems not to be the case. So this is a long meditation on nature in order to find something essential and integral about yourself as a human being in the world. That's absolutely great. Let's go down into some of the detail that you adduce to wanting this sense of being a migratory, flowing, at home in the world kind of person. Let's take the title, Babylon, Albion.
Yeah.
Babylon, you trace within the book lots of very interesting etymologies. Babylon, Bab-Ilim, the gate of God.
Yeah.
And Albion, from, as you say, I never did Latin myself, from albus, from the Latin, meaning white. So we know where Dumbledore's name comes from, of course. And also gives its name to one of the first sort of martyred saints of Britain, St. Alban, the patron saint of refugees.
Yeah.
You're digging down into our language, into our culture and its history to kind of find ways to represent to yourself how to be in the present. Have you found this an entirely satisfactory process, this digging down into the language and the stories around language, or have you found kind of things that you've come up against which you found challenging or difficult?
That's a really good question. And I think often, stories can feel overly romantic, of course. Mythologies can feel, by nature, they are overly romantic. They romanticize, and they can feel sometimes too neat. What I like about nature in the outdoors is that it is not neat and it is not overly romantic. It's very honest. It's very real. What I find really beautiful about these mythologies, these folklores, is that they allow me to relate to nature in a way that feels understandable, feels accessible, I feel like I belong to nature through folklore, through mythologies. So when you refer to things like, Babylon, Albion, the title, this is the first thing that I actually was set on, was the title, because, a lot of people ask me, like, why this title and why the mythologies? And like I just said, I think that mythologies and folklore and even etymologies that might not be entirely accurate but are still very fantastical and beautiful and romantic to me, they allow me to access the natural world in a way that makes me feel like I belong to it very much so, and it belongs to me. But in terms of, the difficulties with these stories, I think, like I said, sometimes they feel a bit too neat, they feel a bit too tidy, and sometimes they might, even with St. Alban, yes, he was the first proto-martyr of England or of Britain, and supposedly the patron saint of refugees. But actually the research is really grey and really, it's not very clear. So I had to kind of, technically that's true, but I did have to do a lot of going around certain things and leaving some things out in order to make that fit into the story. And that would happen a lot with my research, where I would find something that seemed like it would really fit into the story and prove my point really well. Britain, and especially England, has borrowed, or in fact taken, almost all of its national symbols and identities from the rest of the world, when really there's a lot of writers and thinkers from English history who have attempted to return to this, as you say, organic and place. And yes, it has been extremely problematic in certain places where those traditions have been used to bolster, problematic thinking. I think maybe in my book, I tried to, I guess I tried to show these traditions in a new light by also cross-referencing them with the Iraqi or Arabic, traditions or literary heritage. But these, let me be clear, the literary traditions or poetry tradition in Iraq has also been used in a very problematic way. There are a lot of writers, for example, in Iraq who are very ethno-nationalist, Arab writers who have been very problematic towards the Kurdish minorities, for example. I'm sure there are poets in my book who have said deeply problematic things about the Kurds. But I also include an Assyrian writer, and the Assyrians are a group of people who have, from the region of Iraq, what's now called Iraq, who there's almost none of the indigenous population of Assyrians living in Iraq to this day. They've all been exiled. So yes, these literary traditions can be deeply problematic. And I think, in hindsight, the book is very small, relatively small, and I didn't want to distract from my main focus.
Yes.
So I think I touch on St. George, or I touch on St. George, and I touch on that tradition, but I didn't want to divert so much the attention from my line of thinking. That was actually a problem that I had throughout writing. That's something I struggled with, was trying to stay close to the line of thinking and to not, because I could have gone down this route of talking about how these romantic or even animist literary traditions, which I love, have been problematized. Or used problematically, I should say. I even think about Tolkien, and I love Tolkien and I love the Lord of the Rings, but the Lord of the Rings today has this tendency to be associated with the right, and has been associated with this idea of Britain as this pure, do you remember when the Lord of the Rings was adapted into a TV show? And the cast was very diverse, and a lot of people who are hardcore Tolkien fans had a real issue with that. They said the elves were white and are white English people. But I say it in my book. The first English person
and
was
the Ents are the trees are
exactly. And the first English person that we've ever found, in Britain was a person with dark skin,
Cheddar
likely
man.
black, exactly,
Yes.
the Cheddar man,
blue eyes, black skin.
And I think. Yeah, I'll stop there because I was going to go down a whole other route, but I do try to touch on the faults in this line of thinking.
Yes. Within the book, you speak about opening a cupboard in your mother's kitchen, and the smell of spices immediately take you back to Baghdad, or where your grandparents moved to Amman in Jordan. That smell is a kind of pathway, and it's telling a story of your family, and of course you get a good hit from that. Yeah, it's a nice feeling. And the reflection that perhaps a large part, if not most, of the formerly Iraqi populations are now in the diaspora.
Yeah.
That comes up against something described by the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, where he says those Palestinians in their refugee camps in Lebanon and elsewhere, they find their paths back to their villages through the smell of their mother's coffee. How do you see those two things abutting, coming up against each other, the pleasures of movement and the losses inscribed in the peasant territorial cultures from which you come?
This is a brilliant question. This is something I struggle with daily, actually, and I don't think I'll ever fully come to terms with the fact that I was born on British soil, but in a way I feel like I was forcibly removed from my land because it was not my choice to be a British-born Iraqi. I'm very grateful to my parents for having sought a better life. And I'm very privileged that I was born in Britain and that I hold a British passport because of the socio-political context within which I exist. At the same time, I'm devastated about the fact that I don't feel a tangible, material connection to Iraqi soil and to Iraqi land, just like the Palestinian, plight and tragedy, and so many Middle Eastern and Arab and Swana refugees and immigrants do. I think what I'm always trying to do in all of my work is try to find a place where we can make peace with the fact that we have been forcibly removed from a place, and maybe the way back to a land, if not materially and literally, is through the spice cupboard, is through our mother's coffee, is through stories, is through folklore. Because for me right now, it's not reasonable for me to return back to Iraq. My parents wouldn't want that for me. They built a life here for a reason. And I've only visited Iraq once. because it's never been safe to do so beforehand. As someone with a British passport, it was unsafe for me to travel. Now I'm an adult and I can make my own choices. I can travel as I please and I can visit family back in Iraq, but a lot of Iraqis are trying to leave at the same time. What I've been attempting to do, and I think what I will be attempting to do for the rest of my life, and it might never come to a conclusion, is the home landing, which Dalia Al-Dujaili talks about. She talks about it in terms of Iraqis returning to Iraq and recreating their home, and as in rebuilding their literal houses. But there's also an idea of when you're in diaspora and you're unable to return back to your homeland for multiple reasons. A lot of Palestinians are like this as well. We have to homeland. We have to create a homeland.
You remark in the book seeing people emerging from mosques in Britain with their kind of jalabiyas and their kind of really brand new Nike trainers. Yeah. And you reflect that sort of actually the mosque hasn't been the center of your spiritual life.
Yeah.
Nature has been. You're a bit of a British romantic pantheist. In nature you find God.
Luckily, my parents never imposed anything on me, but they very much introduced religion to us, both Christianity and Islam. So at home, we had slightly more Muslim traditions. We come from a Muslim, background. I have a Muslim name. So culturally, we're Muslim, and we observe Muslim holidays and traditions like Eid and Ramadan, and I fasted when I was younger, and so did my parents. But then outside of the home, I went to a Church of England school. It was a little Christian village with like 7 churches in one village. And I found that really comforting in a way. And I found a lot of comfort in religion in like the storied sense.
Yes.
And the cultural sense.
Yes.
But when it came to spirituality, I never felt a spiritual connection to religion. I never felt access to God through religion.
Formal religion.
Yes, institutional religion. Yeah. I always found an access to God or the feeling of what one would now call God, I think, because as a child, I didn't know how to name that feeling, I think. But, in hindsight, I would call that the spiritual, I would call that faith, and I would even call that God. This feeling when you're in nature. And even Zainab Abelk, who's my friend, who's in the book, she's Muslim, she's practicing, but she said the same things to me, that though she's Muslim and she finds God through her Islamic practices, she also finds God in nature. And I really wanted to draw that link between Islam and the natural world, and somewhat Christianity in the natural world. But because I have more of a literal kind of connection to Islam, I really wanted to present a more nuanced, I guess, experience of Islam. Yes. I wanted to present, this idea that actually Islam is a very green religion, and there's so many beautiful ideas in Islam that ask us to steward the land.
In Britain, lots of people of the global majority of colour from the former colonies have said to me, well, kind of the climate emergency, climate change, that's a white bourgeois middle class concern. It doesn't concern us. Yeah. And so I have to take them through some fairly short steps. So, for example, Sierra Leone, it was 90% tropical rainforest when the British arrived, and when they left, it was 4% tropical rainforest. That's where all the mahogany desks and tables come from. But that's about the same proportion of forested land that's been eradicated in Britain.
Yeah.
So can you speak a little bit about, perhaps from your generation, about centering the climate emergency, centering environmentalism as a way to rethink a future?
So my generation, I think, from what I've experienced, is, I don't want to speak for a whole generation, but I think we're very interested in finding the antithesis of that, which a lot of us find in things like folklore, story, even pagan traditions. There's a huge pagan revival happening at the moment. I'm not the person to speak on that because I don't necessarily.
But our ears are open.
Yeah. So Zakia Sewell, for example, she's a brilliant thinker. She's writing her own book right now called My Albion, and I highly recommend everyone reads the book when it's out, but also listens to her podcast, which is called My Albion. People like Lally Macbeth, who she's a kind of folklorist, but she's also part of this idea of the pagan revival. Many articles have been written about this idea that young people are looking towards like a folkloric history, especially in places like Britain, which are so tied up and associated with the empire and with colonialism and things that have literally caused the ecological crisis and the climate crisis right now. And I think, like you said, Iraq, for example, is a place that is one of the countries that is the most at risk from climate change. And we're seeing already a lot of climate refugees in Iraq, specifically in the marshes, because the marshes have dried up so much.
They've been drained. They were actively drained by Saddam Hussein to flush out opponents.
They were actively drained. They are still being drained by its neighbours because the rivers are being drained, and the water flow is being blocked.
A dam in Turkey and
exactly,
so on.
the dam in Turkey and by its neighbour Iran. And so you've got the kind of like geopolitical reasons as to why Iraq is really struggling ecologically, but then that's being compounded by the climate crisis. It's not just one or the other, it's both. And this is what I talk about in terms of the polycrisis. We have to be aware of how these issues are all interconnected. The reason I'm so interested in the past is because through the past we can understand the similarities and the symmetries between places like Mesopotamia or Iraq and Britain. For example, with the Druids and with the ancient Sumerians, these people were animists. And this comes back to your question about religion. These people were animists. They believed that the soil was alive with spirits, that the trees still had spirits. Even in the marshes, people believe that to this day, though they are Shia Muslim people, just like your father from a Yoruba tribe, they still have their pagan beliefs, which then merge with the newer faith that is introduced. I'm fascinated by these connections to land, and we find these connections to land around the globe. And people, I think, in Britain are forgetting about them, which is why people in my generation, for example, or some people, are leading a pagan revival, because they are really committed to rerouting themselves in British land without the association with empire.
You mentioned these kinds of these beliefs in Britain. It would be something like ley lines, wouldn't it?
Yes, exactly.
But that also put me in mind of the Bruce Chatwin concept from Aboriginal Australia of the song lines.
Yeah.
And your book, Babylon Albion, literally these are the song lines that traverse both the Levant, the Southwest Asia, the Near East, the Middle East, and the littoral off the coast of Northern Europe. It somehow kind of connects them in the way that sort of stories can be ways of being in place and perhaps kind of repairing our relationship to place. You quote with approval, I think, an Irish writer who says that our myths, our stories, are the fruits of our unconscious, and that somehow within us there is a potential or capacity to give birth to a way of being in the world that can repair and restore. Is that your most deeply held, almost semi-religious spiritual belief, that we have within ourselves the capacity to repair and to restore?
Yes, I believe actually quite fundamentally and quite spiritually, in fact, that we must be in relationship with people who are fundamentally different to us to understand the fundamental similarities between us. And only through that connection can we start to repair things like the climate crisis, can we only start to embark on processes like decolonization? Because even this term decolonization, or even terms like the climate crisis, they make a lot of people really afraid. They want to reject those ideas because they don't want to associate themselves with what that means. They don't want to hear about the climate crisis because it means that they might have to do something about it. They don't want to associate with decolonization because that means they are a victim of colonization. And I think only
perpetrator.
Or a perpetrator, exactly, very much so. For example, in Britain, if you are at all kind of critical of the British or the British Empire, British society around you might shun you because they see themselves as the perpetrators of that. And I fundamentally disagree with that idea that we should not be listening to our histories and our past simply because, that might implicate you in something, in a crime or. But yeah, I think that I found a lot of fundamental reparation in myself through connecting with people in Britain who are fundamentally different from me. I'm talking about when I've been on farmland with people. I'm talking about when I'm on hikes with people through wilderness. I'm talking about when I'm observing the loss of woodland, ancient woodland in Britain, for example. I think the times when my Iraqi heritage and my Iraqi ancestry are the most powerful in my life are actually when I'm engaging in British soil and in British ecologies and landscapes because I care about them so much. It's almost like I call upon my Iraqi heritage, the Iraqi folklore, stories of Mesopotamia, of Babylon, quite specifically, and I'm able to kind of apply them in the context, within British landscapes because I care about British soil, I care about British woodland, ancient woodland. And that's my connection to the woodland is through my ancestors, through how they cared for land, how they cared for soil.
It's a fantastic read and really inspire people. And inspire people who are kind of urban, New English, to think, we can actually kind of spread out and perhaps should spread out into the lungs, into the forests, into the rivers, into the landscapes of Britain in ways that we've been slightly hemmed in the cities.
Absolutely. I really, really hope. I'm glad you said that and you kind of ended on that point because I'm really, really hoping that this book, I don't have a goal with the book. It wasn't written for any specific kind of reason or purpose, but what I really hope for is that diasporic peoples from anywhere feel like they belong to any land because they have a responsibility to steward that land. And I say that because I think what you just said, Gabriel, is that, a lot of people a lot of migrants or a lot of diaspora who are born in urban areas in the UK, for example, might not feel welcome in the British outdoors because of its very problematic and very traumatizing past and connections. But actually what I'm really hoping is that I propose a new kind of idea of what British landscape means to people like myself. And we can begin to reimagine that. And I think by taking the past and what the past has taught us and what our ancestors' stories have taught us and applying that to our future, we can begin to reimagine what identity means and what national identity means and what cultural identity means. Thank you so much for having me on.
Dalia Al-Dujaili.
Perfect.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriel.
Gabriel Gbadamosi was talking to Dalia Al-Dujaili. To hear more writers, go to writersmosaic.org.uk.